Welcome to Decoding Retirement. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell, and today we're going to go behind the headlines with Sharon Carson, a retirement strategist with JP Morgan Asset Management. Sharon, welcome.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I was going to say it's a pleasure to be here, but I'm actually thrilled to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you here. We've known each other for a very long time, and I can't wait to do a deep dive into a topic that both you and I care a lot about, which is long-term care. And I'd love to talk about it in a way that we also provide our listeners with some actionable advice. So let's start here. The likelihood of requiring long-term care as you age is one of the greatest health-related risks facing retirees. The longer you live, the more likely it is that you'll need care. According to the Treasury Department, they did a report in 2020 and said that approximately half of Americans turning age 65 will need some type of long-term care in their life. So what is it that people need to know about long-term care?
Well, you said a lot of it is like the longer you live, the more chance that you're going to need it. And I think it's really one of these things that's super hard to plan for because, some people need it, some people don't.
And you don't know whether
which camp you're going to be in.
Yeah.
And then even for the people who do need it, some people need it for a very short period of time, and other people need it for a really long period of time. For example, if you are using paid care, and not everyone uses paid care. A lot of people just rely on their family, or they qualify for Medicaid, and they're using paid care basically when the money runs out, and most of that option is just a nursing home. You don't get as many options if you're relying on Medicaid. But if you're using paid care, it might just be a few hours at a day to relieve family or friends, or it could be, the other side of the equation. And, about a third of the people end up, needing it for less than 3 years, but then the paid care. But on the other end, about a third of the people need it for more than 5 years. And the other thing is that makes it so tricky is if you look at how much they're paying out of their own pockets, so not from insurance or the government or anything else, you see about a quarter of the people are spending less than $25,000, which in the scheme of things doesn't sound, for most people who have some money who aren't going to be on Medicaid, probably very doable. But then you have the other side where you have 30%. Who are, if they're using paid care, are spending more than $250,000. And so that's...
And you don't know whether you're going to be in that group or the other group.
No, so you don't. So how do you deal with this? What's the answer? And we think there's not just one answer. There's no silver bullet. No one answer is going to be right for everybody. But it really takes sitting down and looking at your plan in terms of what are all of the things that I might be able to do? I think for a lot of people, it's going to be a combination. It's not going to be just one thing. So family and friends, that's probably a big one for a lot of people. At least you're going to get, even if you're going to pay for care, you're probably going to get some help, most of us, from family and friends. So that's one. Two is, if I'm using care or a spouse is using care, you're not traveling anymore, right? You're probably not going out to dinner. So you may have savings and also your expenses might go down. So it's that sort of savings and spending equation can start to change. So your travel budget or different things like that can change. So that's the second thing. A third thing, of course, is insurance. And that's what a lot of people think about. Long-term care solution is automatically insurance. But I think realize, does insurance have to pay for it all? Because I think people get stuck. They stop because it's expensive, right? It's expensive. And then they're like, I can't afford it. And then they're done.
The policy lapses, yeah.
Right. Or they
don't even buy it.
They don't buy it. They never even get there, right? And so realize it may not have to cover the whole thing. If you're going to look at all these solutions in tandem, how much does insurance really have to cover? And then there's sort of the whole use it or lose it aspect of the traditional insurance. And I always used to say, think about it like home insurance, right? You have one home that is going to be covered with all of these other homes in the same pool. Home insurance, while it can be very expensive, the chance that you're going to need it is much less than you're going to need long-term care, right? So if you cover your long-term care expenses from the very first day that you might need care, and you try to cover it all, no wonder it's going to be so expensive, because we just talked about, you have a very high likelihood of actually using it, the benefit. So then it just, but there are these combination products, right? You can take, it's like a life insurance combination, annuity combination, or if you do go the traditional route, you could put in what's called a longer elimination period, where you can cover some of if you have a short event, you can cover that. But if you go for a really long time, if you're really scared about the 5 years plus or something, the insurance can pick up later. Or the insurance can pick up part of the cost, right? And you can shoulder part of the cost. That can bring the affordability way down. So that's one way to think about the insurance. And also, it could just maybe be life insurance for a surviving spouse. My dad needed care, and even though my parents had a very good nest egg, they have pensions, my mom started to get scared, because what if all of the assets were spent down on my dad's care? I mean, she cared for him a long time at home, and then she brought in care, and she could afford that, but when he had to go to, there's no choice. Once there was absolutely no choice and he had to go to assisted living, she got worried, is there going to be anything left for me if I need care? And it's kind of like, okay, is life insurance for a surviving spouse something that could help alleviate that situation? And then there's home equity, right? And home equity, one of the ways it can be used is a home sale if you're going to move into assisted living. My father-in-law and mother-in-law did that. And that's providing plenty for my father-in-law to stay at as long as he needs to. So he's fine now.
And oftentimes the housing stock in the U.S. is not age-friendly, so it just becomes impossible to live on the first floor or have a whatever you might need to live there.
So you need to think about these kinds of things when you're considering, and then home equity also is like, what's the housing market going to be when you need it? Or do you have a much younger spouse? Like, the much younger spouse may not want to sell the house at that point, right? If you have spouses in similar age, then it can work out a lot better. But home equity is definitely an option, whether it's a home sale or a reverse mortgage. And a lot of people, that's their only asset. Real savings. Right. That's like their main asset. So certainly being able to use it. And then of course there's also what's called CCRCs, or the continuing care retirement communities, and also called now life plan communities. Are trying to rebrand. I have an aunt and uncle in one of these, and they love it.
They love it. It's expensive.
Yes. Well, what they did, and they have different contract types. So some of them, the one that they did, you pay more up front, and then you're just covered. If you need more care, it's covered. It's in there.
Level 2,
right?
Level
Whatever
3.
you are going to need. But you have to be in good health when you go in if you do that kind of contract. But they're also the pay-as-you-go type contracts, and there's different ones that offer different levels of services and different levels of care. So there's a lot of different flavors. But I know they went in and they play music for the other residents. They help the other residents with their computers. They walk the grounds, which are beautiful. So they have been there for a long time, still in their own independent unit, and they do their own cooking. So some of the ones that are have the true step-ups in different levels of care will let you have your own unit where you can still do your own meals and things like that. Other ones are more limited, but there's so many choices.
Yeah. So it sounds like there are multiple solutions: personal savings, family and friends, hybrid insurance policies, home equity, etc. The thing when we write about this topic, more often than not, the story that gets the most page views is the one that talks about Medicaid and protecting your assets and Medicaid annuities and so forth. There's a great deal of interest in people not wanting to spend down there or wanting to sort of protect their assets but qualify for Medicaid. And maybe just briefly, you could just, in 60 seconds, you could say what we need to know.
That's going to vary by state. The main thing I have to say about that is you need to talk to an attorney who knows the laws in your state, because it's not going to be the same in Pennsylvania, New York, Ohio, California. They're all going to be different. And then also realize, like, if you are if you are giving up control of your assets, like I've heard horror stories, right, where people have given up control of their assets to their children, and the children did not take the parents' best interests at heart. Like now, that's not the case. Like my brother has power of attorney for my parents, right? It's not protecting against the Medicaid, but that's not going to be an issue. So, but you have to really think about that. And then also, I think I mentioned earlier, the type of care that you can get may be different in terms of what Medicaid's going to pay for and what you're going to pay for. Because my dad could go into assisted living because my mom and dad were paying for it themselves, which, at least in my view, can be a lot better than a nursing home. Yeah. And you can still get the same. You can actually get really. Some assisted living places will really do a lot of care. And so you have to think about all those kinds of things.
Sharon, we've come, unfortunately, to the end of our time together for this episode, but you'll come back on in future episodes to talk more about J.P. Morgan's Guide to Retirement when it comes out next year. But even before that, we'll have you come back on if you don't mind.
I would love to come back.
Welcome to Decoding Retirement. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell, and today we're going to go behind the scenes with Surya Kolluri, who is the head of the TIAA Institute. Surya, welcome.
Hey, Bob. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. Surya, I want to do, if you don't mind, a deep dive into a topic that you and I both care a lot about, which is caregiving. And I want to provide our listeners possibly with some actionable advice along the way. So let's start here. Across the U.S., family members caring for loved ones provide an estimated $600 billion in unpaid services each year, sacrificing time, money, and often their well-being to care for aging loved ones. That's according to an AARP survey. Where to begin on this topic from your perspective?
Bob, it's such a pleasure being here with you to have this dialogue, and I agree with you. This is an important topic that we should all be focusing on as individuals, as families, as employers, as we will talk about, and as a society at large. I think you would agree that planning for caregiving is important, and it's timely as the need for caregivers, in our observation, is about to skyrocket. And Bob, you and I have talked about this many times in the past also, that approximately 10,000 boomers have been turning 65 every day. And this year, we are even calling it peak 65. More than 10,000 are turning 65 every day. And they're also living longer lives. And life expectancy is increased by about 17 years since Social Security was passed all those years ago. And so I think it's very important for individuals and families to include this topic of caregiving in financial planning. Now, here are some statistics that should wake us up. 1 in 5 adults provide care, and let's call it uncompensated care, meaning informal caregivers like you and me, not paid caregivers. So 1 in 5 adults. On average, what we find is, expenses like housing, healthcare, transportation can add up to about $7,000 a year, 7,200 to be exact. So what I mean is, out of our pockets, informal caregivers, you and I, if we enter this caregiving window, taking care of elders in our family, that's the amount, 7,200 to be more accurate. Caregivers in general, we find, have lower financial assets and higher levels of debt compared to those who don't care for loved ones. And here's another statistic that is also striking. 1 in 4 of those caregivers have less than $1,000 in savings and investments. So for non-caregivers, the number is close to 1 in 7. Now, what are these dimensions of caregiving? Caregiving, if you enter this phase of caregiving, it typically requires 24 hours a week of caregiving time. And about 60% of caregivers have jobs outside of the home. So you're managing your job and the caregiving responsibility. So as a result, what we find is that 61% of those caregivers reported at least one work-related consequence. And what do I mean by that? Arriving late, leaving early, taking time off, or as we saw during the pandemic, retiring sooner than planned. Well, I'll make one last point in answer to this question. Um, there's a financial aspect of this, as I've been describing, and these are often steeper for women and for millennials. And a disproportionate number of caregivers we find 60% are women, and 25% of the caregivers are in their 20s or 30s. So becoming a caregiver, for example, at an early age, as we can imagine, has heightened implications because people at this age group might not be in their peak earning capacity. So they might have lower salaries and should be focusing on taking strides in their careers. Now they have this other responsibility. So, and we're all used to talking about the sandwich generation. So many people in that age group, the millennial age group, are also raising children. And so this creates even more emotional and financial burdens on them. So that is a little bit of a painting the picture, Bob, on this important topic of caregiving.
Surya, here's the issue, I think. Too often adult children and their parents don't plan ahead and have to deal with these caregiving issues when there's a crisis. And I'm often fond of telling people that what you need to do is, in much the same way that you might have an investment policy statement, you might need an elder planning policy statement that deals with issues like housing and transportation and medical care and quality of life issues and death and dying issues. Thoughts about that?
So Bob, for all my talk about caregiving, when I entered into my caregiving responsibility phase with my father, retired Professor Kolluri, who's 88 now, that dialogue was not easy. So I could be an expert in caregiving, but when it comes to the actual dialogue with your parent, it's difficult all over again. And it's been a 3-year journey for me. And he had a crisis New Year's Eve this past year. And but because I was prepared, I was able to get caregiving into his life, much more readily than I would have otherwise. But it was not easy getting him to agree to that caregiving responsibility. So I do not want to underestimate the importance of this dialogue, and I also appreciate that's not going to be easy either. But having said all that, having caregiving in your financial planning can be important. And as we've been discussing, it can be physically, it can be financially, it can be mentally stressful. And having a financial plan does the following. When caregiving responsibility happens, Bob, I think you would agree, it's a hair on fire moment. We're all going to go through that. But if you had a plan in place, you can put out that fire quicker. So that is the importance of having a plan in place. I also think there's a terrific role employers can play in this situation because it can be productivity loss if a peak performer at the company, goes into this caregiving responsibility. So benefits can be added such as flex time, paid family leave, geriatric care management, emergency backup care, paperwork. And these will kind of really help alleviate an employee's stress around this, and training the frontline manager to make sure that they can provide these resources, communicate these resources to their staff can be very valuable. And there's also a tool. It's called the Caregiving Intensity Index. It's kind of a 2-minute self-assessment that measures how caregiving affects someone's well-being and how they're coping with financial stressors and other stressors. This is already being used by several employers and state governments, and that would be an idea as well.
Yeah. As we're talking, most recently, KFF, which you're familiar with, published a report that said an increasing number of older adults are living alone. They're solo agers. And does that complicate matters for this caregiving topic in terms of not having support perhaps in your house if you're the older adult that's solo aging?
Yeah, we should be talking about lifespan and health span matching each other. In other words, you don't want to be living a longer life and then not in good health. And one of the detrimental factors, contributors to ill health is loneliness. So social connections are very important. And so this cannot be stressed enough. And so, but to your point, there could be many in our society who are alone for a variety of reasons. And I think that is the time to depend on community resources or living in a setup such that there is, structurally speaking, company as well.
Yeah. Surya, I want to switch topics for a second. You at the TIAA Institute have done quite a bit of research. Most recently, you looked at Gen Zs and their saving habits for retirement. And according to the study, just 20% of Gen Z is saving for retirement. And I'm curious, what can be done to change their mindset and put them on the path toward building wealth?
Yeah, this was a terrific study. I'm so glad you noticed it. And by the way, when we did the study, Bob, I think you might find this interesting. We had Gen Z do the research. Of course, I was there participating and supervising, etc. But it was a Gen Z study done by Gen Z in a Gen Z voice. And I think that was a very refreshing take on this study. And what we found was when Gen Z view retirement and the path they will take to get there, there is a breaking of financial norms from other generations. The word freedom came through a lot in the study, and they do not see their professional life stopping at age 62. And they also don't think they'll be working for the same company for their entire career. So this freedom, they want financial freedom to make career changes, to travel, to take professional breaks, sabbaticals, gap years. But of course, reality strikes, have a harder time paying for school or a mortgage, which used to be seen as core components to any financial plan. So what we're finding in this study is that the traditional path to retirement is not as compelling to this early in their careers generation. So as an industry in financial services, we need to consider what the future of retirement might look like for them and implement thoughtful solutions aligned to their mindsets. In other words, we can't say they don't get it. They're soon going to get a reality check, but rather we need to meet them where they are and the values that they're espousing and they're kind of pursuing. So the findings in our research I find interesting. It underscores the need, I think, to help Gen Z prepare for the future with professional advice and planning that links financial basics and saving with freedom for fun. So let me emphasize that, this word freedom for fun. So for many Gen Z, employer-provider plans can be the first step, of course, to help them get on the right path to financial security. The last point I'll make on this very interesting topic is that in the financial services industry, we need to meet the Gen Z where they are, wherever they are on their financial journey. And we need to reimagine how we educate them on the importance of retirement savings and underscore how a secure retirement ultimately leads to financial freedom. So linking those two. And I'll give you a little bit of a preview. Right now, the Institute is working on a project called The Future of Advice. So how is advice going to change in the 21st century? And I strongly believe this answer that I just gave you and this new study are going to be very strongly tied to each other.
Well, Surya, we've reached the end of our time together for this segment, but maybe in the future you can come back on and talk about the results of that research and other research that you're doing at the TIAA Institute, which is plentiful. So thank you again for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. So that's it for this week's episode of Decoding Retirement. We hope we provided you with some actionable advice to help you plan for or live in retirement. And don't forget, for the latest retirement news and expert analysis, visit yahoofinance.com.
This content was not intended to be financial advice and should not be used as a substitute for professional financial services.